If you do a quick Google search, you'll find story after story of violent crime in the news. You'll hear stories of mass shootings. You'll hear stories of an increase in gun violence. You'll hear stories, or you'll read stories about politicians using the various legislation to try to combat violent crime. Politicians resting their whole campaign on how they're going to combat violent crime. It's everywhere. But the reality is that violence and violent crime is nothing new. It's been around throughout all of history. In fact, this very country was built upon violence, right? The roots of this country are in the Revolutionary War. So it makes sense then that we continue to see violence throughout American history. Right, but what's interesting about violence is that we recognize that things like a school shooting and a incident of domestic violence or intimate partner abuse in the home or a case of arson are all very distinct, discrete incidents of violence. It'd be very difficult to say that somebody burnt the house down because of something that happened across the country at a school shooting, right? Those acts of violence aren't necessarily cause and effect. But what we recognize now, what we start to understand is that all of these acts of violence are part of what is understood as the unity of human aggression, right? Some people argue nature, some people argue nurture, but this idea that there's a characteristics of violent behaviors that kind of feeds them together, right? That they're interwoven and they're rooted within the cultural norms and values of a society. And we can see that generally when you look at acts of violence, especially the more egregious cases of violence, that the motivations are pretty similar. They're angry, they feel slighted, they want to lash out, they have trauma they haven't handled, and they're trying to get even more often than not, or they're angry, right? So what we also see is that regardless of whether it is a tyrant, of a dictatorship country that's attacking another or their own people, or if it's a case of child abuse, right? The parents feel as though the parents or the dictator feel as though their use of violence is justified, right? Or perhaps if you came to a case of intimate partner abuse where a couple had been physical with each other, the likelihood that both felt their use of violence was fair or justified is quite high. Right. And so what this has kind of spawned this idea or this notion of what's called righteous slaughter. And so this was developed by an outstanding sociologist named Jackson Katz. And he talks about the way in which perpetrators of violence develop this rage that culminates into that violence, right? And it's usually through some sort of humiliation or degradation or some injustice, right? And so they view their violence as not only is it justified, but that it's in defense of some moral value or some important principle, right? And so this is a common theme, especially among mass shooters. We'll see that a lot. We'll talk about those later in the semester as well. And again, as I mentioned, right, all of these acts of violence are interconnected in the sense that they are all enabled or developed or bred, right, by the culture within which we live. And so an interesting phenomenon or argument for this, right, to kind of explain this interconnection of violence is known as the spillover effect. And it's rooted in the spillover theory, which is this idea that the same rationalizations, justifications, and values that allow me to use violence in a socially acceptable setting will eventually, quote unquote, spill over into other settings where it would typically not be a socially acceptable behavior. And so this is what produces illegitimate forms of violence. So, for example, we know that people involved in the military have a greater likelihood of committing acts of violence even after leaving their time in the military. And this is also, we know that there's research that suggests that some police officers are more likely to be involved in violence because they are confronted with and they see violence every day in their everyday lives. And another example of this spillover effect is through what's known as the brutalization hypothesis. And this was used to explain the fact that the states that have the highest rates of executions or, use of the death penalty, they are more likely to have higher rates of violence. And so the idea is, or the hypothesis, argument goes, that the use and the application of the death penalty kind of desensitizes people to, the killing or the taking of life. And so it kind of fosters a tolerance, whether it's indirectly or as subtly as it may be. It builds a tolerance of lethal behavior, so of the taking of another person's life. We also know that countries that are experiencing war or have experienced war are more likely to have higher rates of illegitimate violence. If you look in places in countries in Africa, the ones that were settled by the more brutal colonizers, the more violent colonizers, right, they are still experiencing significantly high rates of violence, and much more so than countries that were not colonized by as violent of countries. And so this kind of ties to that spillover effect as well. We also know that organized violence creates individual violence. And what I mean by that is going back to the idea that veterans are more likely to engage in violence post-war because they were involved in organized violence. Same thing with the police officers as well. So obviously we see violence is embedded throughout the U.S. We are exposed to it through so many different means and so many different ways, oftentimes without even realizing it. So, obviously we see it in the news, people sharing stories of violent crime, but some of the best movies, some of my favorite movies are, horribly violent. And I love Quentin Tarantino, and he is, as gory as it gets and as violent as it gets. But you also have to think, right? American football, that's our favorite sport, or if you like baseball, more okay, but let's be real, football is better. Sorry, baseball fans. But right, that's arguably quite a violent sport. And, even things like rugby or lacrosse or boxing and, going into the MMA, right? You see a lot higher rates of violence there, and we're exposed to it, and we see it, and it serves to, so the argument goes, desensitize us to violence. Okay, we also, because of how prevalent violence is, we experience what's known as vicarious victimization, or we experience that violence vicariously. So, vicariously means to experience it through somebody else. So for us, we often experience it through the news or through somebody else experiencing that violence. And so a great example of this is after Sandy Hook, all of the school shootings, really. Both my sisters who have young kids were absolutely devastated. And, you would think that they knew somebody there, and they didn't. They live across the country. But what the fear and the devastation, the hurt and the worry it created them for their own children, that can be traumatizing. And it creates a fear of violence, which has an impact on our quality of life, because when we're afraid of things, we behave differently. We miss out on things. We don't go where we would normally go. We don't trust people we would normally trust. We may, not engage in our normal everyday lives, and that's a cost to us as a society. There's also this interesting phenomenon within the United States of this subculture of violence, right? So what we see is that there's various pockets within this country where violence is much more, or it occurs at much higher rates. And this is because violence is developed as a means of defending a person's honor or status or respect. Okay, it becomes a part of their cultural expectations. So, you're going to let somebody step to you like that? You better stand up for yourself. You better show him. You're going to let him swing at you, or whatever it might be, right? You better stand up for yourself with violence. And so the most commonly emphasized place for this idea of the subculture of violence is in the South. And scholars will point to things like the fact that the rates of domestic violence, the rates of robbery, the rates of child abuse, the rates of assaults are all significantly higher in the South. Gun violence, they're all significantly higher in the South. And it ties back to these cultural values that perpetuate this subculture of violence, right? And this is closely related to this culture of honor. And we'll come back to this down the road, but I just wanted to introduce this to you now. So this brings us to the next question then. What is violence? Well, as I mentioned, right, most people probably think of firearms or, murder, okay? But as I noted too, right, we see violence on television and sports and MMA and football. Violence is all around us. There's violence in the animal kingdom. If you have pets, I have 2 dogs, and they don't actually hurt each other, but somebody could perceive it as being violent, right? We talked about the military as being engaged in violence. We also will discuss some of the ways that the state or the government or the police are involved in violence as well. And it's really critical here to recall or to note that not all crimes are violent, and not all violence is criminal, right? So think about, for example, self-defense. We know that if you use violence in self-defense, that is not criminal. But the consequences of those violent actions, are they really that distinct whether or not they're criminal? That's up for debate. Okay, so violence, as I said, it encompasses so many different types of behaviors across so many different situations. Could it be driving recklessly? Could it be a tornado? Right? That violence could range so far. And so I encourage you to take a moment, pause the video and take a moment and try to write some of the things that you would include in violence, or try to develop a definition of your own and see what you come up with. This is an activity that I would use in class a lot because it's more difficult than you would think. And be mindful of, where would you draw the line? At what point does it become violence too? Okay, so with that, moving along, right? So it's also perceived differently depending on who the perpetrator is, who the victim is, right? If you heard that somebody went after, I don't know, Hitler, or I don't know, I mean, somebody that's still alive, I guess, some horrible human being that has done, great, horrible atrocities, and somebody acted violently to them, we all would not be like, oh, that's such bad violence, right? Or, oh, I don't know, maybe you were, I don't know, dancing and you were having a great time and you flung your arm and you hit somebody in the face. Is that violence? Well, it certainly depends on how it's perceived, right? But violence evokes a powerful emotional response for many reasons. It creates fear, and fear is power. And you will hear me say this a lot in this class, because we'll talk about the media's role in violence, because it's so interwoven, it's so connected, so tightly woven. Okay, and again, as I noted already, that violence is often justified by the perpetrators, regardless of who they are. And what's interesting is our perception of the violence of it, whether it was bad or not, if they were right or not, depends on who we are socially closer to, if you will, who we relate more to. So if the offender is somebody that looks like you, that acts like you, that is a similar lifestyle to you, you're more likely to view their violence as justified. Whereas if the victim looks more like you, you're much more likely to think that violence was out of hand. So hopefully you wrote a little definition. Here is one definition, and you could take this so many ways, right? But it's any action or structural arrangement that results in physical or non-physical harms to one or more person. This is a very inclusive definition. It doesn't talk about intent, so whether or not the person intended to cause harm, or the whatever caused harm, and including this non-physical harm, right? That's certainly a broader definition than some would take. So, as I already mentioned, I just added this on here again so you could think in mind. There's some key distinctions here that will help you kind of keep them apart. Okay, so the first is this instrumental versus expressive violence. Okay, so the best way to remember this is that for instrumental violence, the violence is an instrument with which you're getting to your goal. So you're using that violence to achieve some goal. So let's say I am robbing a bank, and a security guard comes out and sees me, so I punch them in the face so I can get away. I wasn't being violent for the sake of being violent. I was being violent so I could get away, right? It wasn't about the violence itself. There was some other goal, okay? And that's in contrast to expressive violence, which the violence is me expressing my feelings, whatever that might be. So I might be angry, I might be jealous, I might be afraid, I might be feeling some sort of internal want or need, and that's expressing it. So I'm not trying to get anything else out of it. So in that bank story, it would be like, I was robbing the bank, I almost got away, the security guard looked at me, dropped his weapon, and was like, no, I'm not going to do anything, and I was like, I don't like your face, and then I hit them. That would be expressive violence. Okay, hopefully that's clear. That's a very important distinction. Okay, and then there's also this distinction between interpersonal, institutional, and structural violence. So interpersonal is as it sounds, right? It's violence between two people. So this could be hitting, kicking, stabbing, shooting, whatever it might be, any violence between two people. And institutional, on the other hand, is more that is perpetuated in an organizational setting. Okay, so think in institutional settings. So it depends on how you defined institutions, but this would be things like within the family. This would be things like in the workplace, things that occur, military related violence, religious violence, police perpetrated violence, things like that. Okay, now it's important to note that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, it could certainly be an interpersonal institutional violence. Okay, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, and so this is in stark contrast, though, to structural violence. Okay, structural violence is that, because again, if we're using the definition of causing harms, okay, these are the ways in which the system, our societal structures are arranged so that they produce harms against certain groups of people. So it could be the inadequate or straight denial of certain healthcare services to certain groups of people based on their race or ethnicity, or housing. It could be anything that they need for survival. That anything that we've done to block them from access to that could be considered structural violence. Okay, there's a really good discussion of this in the book. I urge you to read that carefully. So, violent crime increases every year. Is this true or false? It is absolutely false. Okay, I'm actually going to take this opportunity to bring your attention to something quite important. Okay, if you look at this figure here, it looks as though, oh my goodness, there was this peak. Oh, but we've tapered off a little bit, but it stayed kind of level. That would be your assessment off this 5-year trend. Okay, the charts I'm showing you right now are based on the FBI collected data. It's accumulated from police agencies across the country. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but just know it's reputable. This is the FBI data. Okay, so if you see here, right, this little hump here, it looks like, oh man, things have been increasing. Okay, but if I put this in the broader context for you, this is what our crime rate, or violent crime rate, has done since 1990. In other words, despite what you might be hearing on the news, despite what the politicians or whoever you might be presenting you, or whatever fear story you're hearing, no matter how much it may appear as though violence is increasing, it is significant. I mean, it's less than half of what it once was, or almost less than half of what it once was, 30 years ago. And there's a whole number of things that have been involved in that. And yes, we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick, perhaps. It'll be interesting to see once they get the 21 and 22 added on, 21 especially. But this is the most recent data. So it's so important to you that for you that you are critical of statistics and numbers and charts when people give them to you, because you see how deceiving this can be. Okay, so just anytime you hear numbers, dig a little deeper. Okay, that's your part of your job as being a good learner and scholar. So how do we know these numbers? Okay, how do we get these? So we measure violence using 2 primary methods. Okay, the first is official data, and this is exactly as it sounds. These are the official records that we gather from the police, the prosecution, the courts, the hospitals, the jails, prisons, etc., probation officers, whatever. And so we'll use their records to kind of gauge how much violent crime occurred. Okay, the other is known as self-report data, and this is the accounts of the people involved. Right, so this is me telling you. So I may not have been arrested by the police, but I'm telling you that I did this or I experienced this. Okay, and so this is done through surveys, interviews, participant observation, focus groups, any way that you can directly interact with people and ask them questions about their life and what they've experienced. Okay, the most important official data for you to know as a criminal justice student and in this class is NIBRS. Okay, so NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and this was formerly the UCR, and it's still, it's now joined. It's kind of convoluted, but just know they're one and the same now, so all of it's going to the same place. And this is and has been the primary means of gathering data about crime and violent crime in this country. And we get data about all sorts of information, from the offender characteristics, victim characteristic, location, if a weapon was involved, the time of the day, how many people were there, the level of injuries. You name it, we've got it all. So the victim-offender relationship, if they knew each other. It's a very inclusive, very thorough data set. Unfortunately, however, only about 50% of police agencies in the country participate. So it's incomplete, at least in that sense. Okay, the other is a supplementary homicide reports that was closely linked to the UCR, but now everything's just through NIVERS. Okay, but there's a significant problem about official data. Okay, and that is that it is reliant upon people getting caught. Because how would the police know that I was involved in any sort of violence if they never caught me? So I'm missing all of this data. And that crime is known as a dark figure of crime. So the dark figure of violent crime would be the part of the violent crime that is not reported to the police, that doesn't come to the attention of the authorities, okay, and that official data can't gauge as a result. So, if you think like the iceberg, right? Think like this iceberg, right, where we have this top piece that we see, but really there's this whole branch of, or a whole chunk of unreported crime that we don't know anything about. And so we use self-report data to get at that. The clearest example of this is if you look at sexual assault cases and how far them go. If I wanted to get a good grasp of what sexual assault offenders were like, what do they have in common, right? And I was going to say, okay, let's look at people that have been convicted of sexual assault. Okay, well, that's that where it says people proven guilty. So that means if I was going with those numbers, I would be looking at 0.9% of cases, less than 1%. Okay, so we know, even just those reported to the police is about 20%. And that's even, these numbers are even, you got to take it with a grain of salt too. Okay, but you can see why it's so important that we find a way to get at those that don't get reported. And so the leading survey for this is the National Crime Victimization Survey. And it collects data from randomly sampled houses every 6 months for 3 years. And it follows them up and it tracks them and it asks them about things. It's designed to be representative of the American population. Okay, it has a 90% completion rate, which is outstanding. Okay, and that gives us a very complete look. In other words, 90% of the people that are asked to fill it out do. Okay, and they're asked not about their offending, about their victimization. And one of the benefits of this is that people tend to be a little bit more forthright about their victimization than they do about their offending, right? Because they don't have to be afraid of getting in trouble. And based on these results, right, we estimate that what's in that NIVERS is about a third of the actual rate of violent crime. And it does vary from crime type, but in general. So there's significant strengths and weaknesses here. I'm not going to go over this. The book does a really great job. Just use this slide to go over it. But in general, these are about NCVS in particular, but it's true about self-report data in general. At least the strengths are. And as for the weaknesses, all self-report data, their fundamental flaw, right, is that people lie. People lie. And as a result, oftentimes we don't know if they lied and exaggerate. Oh yeah, I've committed way more. I've been victimized way more, or I've never experienced that when they had, right? And so it's hard to know if they're exaggerating or under exaggerating. But so what? Why is this so important for us to know? Well, first, what do we know? This is from 2018. Okay, so it's a little bit dated now, but still you can see, the rates of violence, when you think about it this way, that one person in the U.S. is murdered every 30 minutes. That somebody's raped every 3 minutes? That is a staggering rate of violence. Okay, so that alone should tell you why understanding this data or why gathering this data is important. But it's also so critical because it gives us an idea of crime patterns, right? So are we seeing gun violence increase? Are we seeing arson increase or decrease? What could be related to that? What could we do to help that? How could we, where do we need to concentrate our efforts? Okay, we can also use them to look at the geographic patterns of crime. Like, wow, as I mentioned, rates of domestic violence are significantly higher in the South than everywhere else in the country. Why is that? What should we do now? How do we use the Southern culture to shift that? Okay, because obviously addressing domestic violence in the South is going to be far different than addressing domestic violence in California, right? The cultures and the values and the norms are just significantly different. Okay, and this data is how we make decisions about how we allocate funding and resources. Okay, and I urge you to think about some other things. So why else does this data matter? You should be able to make a solid case that it is critical for us to have a solid understanding and a reasonably accurate estimate of what violence looks like in this country. So be thinking about that as you're getting ready for the assignment and the exam. And I'm going to leave you with that, and I'll see y'all next time.